My friend, whom I'll call Jake, was a year below me in school, so he joined my dorm around the beginning of his sophomore year. He was tall and skinny, with a relatively intelligent face. At first, Jake was open and funny, but after about 6 months, his personality changed completely. During that time, he slept a lot. Whenever there was a chance, he would be found sleeping. Once, I invited him to form a team to play League of Legends. When we were about to gank in the jungle, I waited for a response from support, but it turned out Jake had fallen asleep, slumped over in his chair, snoring. At first, our dorm was understanding because everyone has their own hobbies, but when the whole dorm went home for the weekend and Jake stayed behind, I called him to help carry my things when I arrived back. After half an hour with no response, I took a taxi to find out he was still asleep. The craziest part was that he hadn't even locked the door. Luckily, we had good roommates, and everything was intact. The next day, our dorm held a meeting to discuss his behavior. Not to scold him, but everyone pretended to be quite upset. That was when Jake finally confessed that he had been sleeping so much because he was being haunted by a child's ghost. First, I should mention Jake's family background. His grandmother sold paper offerings, and his parents often left him with her. A few days before the Ghost Festival, she received too many orders for paper offerings. With no room left in the house to store the effigies, she moved some of them outside onto the porch. At 5 years old, Jake didn't know about superstitions and still played outside on the porch well after 9 p.m. His grandmother was busy painting the effigies inside, so she didn't pay attention. He saw the paper figures and went over to touch them, lifting their clothes to look inside. At one point, one of them suddenly fell over, and Jake, fearing his grandmother would scold him, bent down to pick it up, glancing at the door to see if she would come out. When he propped the effigy back up against the others, he felt as if someone had pushed it over, and it fell again. The second time he was about to set it up, he noticed a face peeking out from behind the figures. The face told him that was its place and directed Jake to place the effigy over there instead. Jake described the face as looking like a child, but it had no eyebrows, no teeth, and its eyes and mouth were completely black, with wet hair and some kind of liquid oozing from its ears. It sat curled up among the paper figures, staring blankly at Jake. From the moment he saw the child, Jake lost all sense of reality. The child told him to take the effigy and walk to the other side, and even after reaching the end of the porch, he wasn't allowed to put it down. Jake said the child had a very foul mouth, cursing and wishing death upon some guy named Mr. Sin, saying it would strangle and gouge out the eyes of his entire family. When Jake's arms grew tired and he tried to drop the effigy, the ghost dragged him along, insisting he keep holding it, or else it would shove his head into the bushes, scratching his face. At that point, they had reached the neighbor's fence. If they went any further, they would end up in the pit latrines behind Jake's house. If his grandmother hadn't noticed in time, he might have drowned in there without ever knowing. Hearing the barking of a dog, Jake's grandmother realized he was missing and rushed out into the yard. He later recounted that she saw a trail of water leading from the porch to the backyard, disappearing at the path next to the neighbor's house. Frightened, she ran inside to grab a knife, took a flashlight, and shone it into the yard, swinging the knife at branches to scare the ghost away. When she reached the base of a tree, she saw Jake standing there holding the effigy, facing the tree and mumbling something indistinct. She immediately swung the knife down next to his head and snatched the effigy away. Jake, startled, looked at her with dazed eyes, and in the flashlight's beam, his grandmother's face appeared pale like a paper figure, causing him to cry and wet his pants. Thinking something was wrong with him, she quickly carried him back to the house, changed his clothes, and noticed that his face was scratched as if it had been clawed. She quickly deduced what had happened. That very night, she went to the chicken coop, caught a rooster, and cut its throat, mixing the blood with raw rice and burning some yellow paper charms that are commonly used during funerals. Since she sold those charms, she had plenty on hand. She mixed the ash from the charms and incense from the altar into the blood rice, her hands stained red. Afterward, she threw handfuls of the mixture around the porch, chanting, "Whoever is asking for food in the middle of the night, here's some rice and meat for you." After finishing, she turned off the lights, locked the door, washed her hands, and climbed into bed with Jake, reassuring him not to be afraid. Anyone who bothered her grandson would face her wrath. The mixture she created is known in the funeral home community as blood bait, similar to the bait used for rats and dogs, but targeted at ghosts who died on the streets. After a while, Jake heard munching sounds outside. His grandmother hoped the ghost following him would eat the bait. If it ate it, the ghost wouldn't die, but it would be scared off, especially since it contained ash from her family's incense. That night, Jake slept with his eyes unable to close tightly. To this day, they remain that way, always slightly open, with the whites showing more than half, making it look like he's staring. I thought his grandmother was skilled enough to get rid of the ghost, and Jake stopped thinking about the past. However, when he returned home to his family, the five of them suddenly received tragic news. That day, Jake and some of the neighborhood kids decided to play hide and seek behind the house, where there was a small creek. Beyond the creek lay a dense thicket of trees. They played until evening, and when it was Jake's turn to seek, the others hid. After 10 or 20 minutes without any sign of him, they figured Jake had run off and left them behind. So, no one continued playing. Each kid went home. When Jake reached his yard, he heard his mother asking where his brother was. He replied that his brother had gone home earlier, but he wasn't inside the house, nor was he in the bathroom. Where could he have gone? Jake hurried back to the creek, calling for him and even climbing into the thicket, but he still couldn't find him. Next, Jake's family set out to search for him, and the neighbors came to help. After searching everywhere without success, they began to suspect that Jake's brother had fallen into the creek. A few people waded into the water, which was deep enough to reach their waists, and it was already dark, making it harder to see. They searched for 2 hours, and by around 10 p.m., they still hadn't found him. Jake's mother remained calm, calling out for her son, hoping he was just hiding somewhere. Then someone standing on a branch of the thicket looked down at the creek and spotted an empty barrel with 2 small feet sticking out. Everyone rushed over to check, and the barrel was taller than an 8-year-old child, meaning it was taller than Jake's brother. But somehow, he was upside down inside the barrel. When they pulled him out, he was already cold, soaked from head to chest. The barrel had only a shallow layer of water, and Jake's brother had drowned with his head submerged, stuck in an upside-down position, unable to escape. During the funeral, Jake saw a strange child squatting outside, staring into the coffin. The child smiled eerily when Jake noticed him. When he told his grandmother about it, she asked if he remembered what the child looked like. He replied that the child had no eyebrows, no teeth, and its eyes and mouth were completely black with wet hair. It took a long time for his grandmother to remember, but she eventually recalled that some time ago, a child's body had been recovered from the creek. The child had slipped and drowned while trying to catch rats. The body had swollen up, and it was found with a rat still in its mouth, leaving the circumstances of its death a mystery. That child was an orphan, and the place where it had lived later became the pigsty of Mr. Sin. The villagers buried the child in the cemetery, but many claimed to have seen a ghost lurking by the creek, catching rats to eat. When Jake recounted this, he felt scared, realizing that his brother had died unfairly. And after a week, he began to see his brother's ghost. In the house, Jake was the closest to his brother. Their parents still kept some of his brother's clothes for Jake to wear, which led to strange occurrences afterward. In the first week after his brother's death, Jake woke up early with his parents to prepare the altar for the family gathering. While the adults were busy outside, Jake sat alone in the house, eating porridge. He sat facing the altar of his brother, but he couldn't eat much. Each spoonful took him several minutes to swallow. Outside, it was still dimly lit, but the lights in the house created a stark contrast, so Jake was absolutely sure he wasn't imagining things. As he ate, he glanced around and noticed that next to the altar, there was a window leading to the backyard. One side was closed, while the other was open. Suddenly, he saw a pale face peering in. Jake couldn't recognize the person's face, but since he was sitting across from his brother's altar, where the candlelight illuminated everything, the pale face looked eerily familiar. Startled, he accidentally knocked his bowl of porridge to the ground. His brother couldn't come into the house, so he could only peek in from outside. Being young and not fully understanding, Jake instinctively asked, "Is that you, brother?" His brother's face was wide-eyed as he glanced at the altar and spoke as if he were choking. My shirt. Give it back to me." The shirt his brother was referring to was the short-sleeved shirt Jake was currently wearing, which was usually passed down from his brother. Their family didn't mind him wearing it. When Jake's mother heard the bowl break, she rushed in, and Jake pointed to the backyard, saying his brother was out there. She opened the window to look, but there was no one outside. When she turned back to ask, she realized that his brother had come back to ask for his shirt, as he was always cold after drowning and could only stand outside the door. Jake's grandmother learned about this and mentioned that when they were alive, the brothers had always been close and loving. After his brother died, they had wrapped up his clothes and belongings, so why would he come back to ask for his shirt? After thinking for a moment, she took a bundle of straw and brought the family dog to the spot where her grandson had died. She tied the dog to a tree and then lit the straw on fire, following it by holding the flame near the barrel, banging on its metal sides loudly. The dog, which had been sniffing around the barrel, suddenly pulled on its leash, barking in a particular spot, stopping every 3 barks. Jake's grandmother paused, looked in the direction the dog was focused on, and instructed the family to turn the altar of Jake's brother to the left, placing it against the wall, perpendicular to the family altar. This way, his brother wouldn't be facing the door anymore. The drowned spirit might still be lurking nearby, and seeing his brother would only lead to mischief. That night, Jake's grandmother dreamt of her grandson returning. He stood outside the door, crying, still wearing a white t-shirt and shorts, lamenting that his parents didn't love him and that he had died in such misery. When she asked how he died, Jake's brother explained that he was drowned by a child hiding in the barrel, mistaking him for Jake because of the clothes they both wore. After crying for a while, a middle-aged man came to take him away. Jake's grandmother recognized him as Uncle Young, her husband's younger brother, and she believed that by turning the altar that morning, the two could finally see each other. Jake's grandmother got up to the altar to light incense and pray for a while, and the next morning, she told Jake's parents that they needed to take him to the temple for a ceremony. She feared that Jake and the drowned boy had exchanged spirits. Children are the most susceptible to being taken by ghosts, and if they acted quickly, it wouldn't be a cause for concern. If they waited too long, as in Jake's case, they could resolve the spirit issue, but the connection with the spirit world would remain. This connection, often referred to in folklore as spiritual affinity, was just beginning to take shape. Before continuing, Jake explained a bit about the mechanism of spiritual affinity. A person is said to have spiritual affinity when they have experienced at least one significant event related to the spirit world in their life. This could be witnessing a fatal accident, attending someone else's funeral, or, in rare cases, having someone in the family involved in spiritual practices, which significantly increases the likelihood of being haunted. Spiritual affinity, in this context, is akin to a bond between two people that only they can perceive. The connection between two deceased individuals and between a deceased person and a living person is similar. For example, Jake and his younger great-grandfather share a spiritual affinity as two deceased individuals. Many people think that being haunted is a simple matter, but they don't realize how difficult it is for a living person to connect with a deceased one. To put it bluntly, even living people need 18 or 20 years to find each other. So the connection between two people from different worlds is often vague, rare, and hard to believe. This affinity is not about romantic relationships. Rather, it's about a compatibility of spirits, a familiarity that feels instant. Typically, the connection between the living and the dead does not exist in a positive sense. When someone is haunted, it is more like a form of suffering for that person. Regarding experiences like being touched or groped by spirits, Jake pointed out that spirits do not have physical sensations related to the earthly body, so such things do not happen. In fact, many accusations of spirits behaving inappropriately usually come from women. while most men report never encountering such incidents. The ratio of male to female spirits is either equal or skewed towards female spirits being more active. So why don't they interact with men? According to women, they sometimes experience sensations while sleeping, feeling hands exploring from head to toe, stimulating them in various ways. However, this phenomenon is known as sleep paralysis, arising from the subconscious of each individual, both male and female, and is often more intense in women. Women have monthly cycles, and a few days before their cycle, they may experience unusual phenomena, feeling hot, craving, and having needs 3 times greater than usual. This is due to heightened hormones, which explains why they might feel such sensations at night. To be honest, spirits have no interest in physically touching women. If they did, they would torment women endlessly, leading to a state where the person is neither fully human nor fully spirit. For those who don't believe this, they should look into the experiences of people who have been haunted or possessed. They describe it as suffering, not the enjoyment some might think. This is one of the most common misconceptions. Spirits also have their own dignity, and their intentions when approaching the living are seldom benevolent. It's important to distinguish between being haunted and being protected, as some people believe that deceased relatives follow them. What is the purpose of an altar in the home or annual memorial ceremonies, if not to honor the deceased? Of course, if ancestors don't follow their children, who else would they follow? When we speak of haunting, we refer to spirits of those who died tragically, without relatives or anyone to honor them, becoming lost souls seeking to claim a living counterpart. At this point, you should have a clearer understanding of the mechanism behind being haunted. First, there must be an event that allows the spirit to identify a target, but not everyone who attends a funeral or witnesses an accident is affected. The second factor depends on the fate and will of the individual, essentially their physical and mental state. Simply put, it's about the overall health and spirit of a person. No one should hope to be haunted. It's a serious matter. Jake believed that children are the most susceptible to being haunted because their nerves are not fully developed. They're more impressionable, fragile, and their ability to perceive is incomplete. Regarding Jake's story, the spirit of the drowned boy later got blocked at the temple. However, even after resolving the haunting, Jake still retained a connection to the spirit world, as his fate was considered deficient according to astrology. To simplify, his brain waves were different from those of ordinary people, allowing him to pick up frequencies from spirits. However, this process of tuning in takes a long time. As I mentioned, spiritual affinity is incredibly difficult to establish. For Jake to truly find a spirit that matched his energy, he had to endure 12 years of hardship, akin to someone suffering from epilepsy. He divided the entire experience into 3 phases, starting from the moment he was drawn into the spirit world by the drowned boy. The first phase began when Jake was in 4th grade. He started to be a bit forgetful, sometimes remembering things and sometimes forgetting them. It was as if the influence of the spirits around him, combined with his developing mind, caused his brain to receive a lot of information at once. Jake would occasionally burst out with a few ideas, but he would forget them quickly. He could even say something one moment and then not remember what he had just said the next. His studies were not on par with his classmates, but fortunately, he was diligent. Even though he often forgot things, he studied hard, which is why his parents didn't suspect anything unusual about his symptoms. During this phase, he also wandered off frequently. Jake recounted one time when he left home to go to the soccer field, but instead, he ended up in the neighboring village. When he snapped back to reality, he couldn't understand how he had gotten there. On another occasion, he went to the market to help his mother sell dried goods. His mother told him to go home and get a bag, but he walked straight to the riverbank, which was over 2 kilometers away from his house. He explained that he heard the sound of drums beating right next to his ear, and he instinctively followed the sound, not thinking about anything else. His parents had to go find him and scold him for getting lost while playing. Since Jake was still young and the signs were vague, nearly every child experiences some degree of distraction. Eventually, he grew up without any further issues. Contrary to what some might think, spiritual affinity isn't established with just a touch. It develops gradually. Spirits are not deities with the power to take lives at will. What gives spirits influence is the resonance between the two parties involved. For two ordinary people, if there is a connection, they will stick together through life and death. Spiritual affinity means that if they cannot coexist, they will find a way to pull the other into death. The second phase occurred 2 years after the first phase ended. After Jake entered middle school, he became more capable of controlling his thoughts. The human brain is the most miraculous product of creation, allowing it to block or filter out erroneous information. From this point on, Jake no longer reacted to the influences of the spirits around him. Many children who see ghosts in their early years lose that ability as they grow up. This phenomenon has been widely discussed online and scientifically proven. However, the brain still has vulnerabilities. At night, when the body is completely relaxed and perception is loosened, the waves of influence still operate. Jake began to suffer from insomnia by 7th grade. He found it hard to fall asleep after lying down. Even if he did manage to sleep, it wasn't deep sleep. He would wake up around 2 a.m., not for any particular reason. In the darkness, he heard the sound of drums tapping, mixed with whispers that seemed to come closer and then fade away. The sounds felt like auditory hallucinations, both frightening and uncomfortable, causing him to stay awake until morning. At first, he could manage, but over time, his head felt heavier, his nerves became tense, and his health deteriorated significantly. His eyes were dark and sunken, resembling someone who hadn't slept in days, and his expression was dazed, as if he were in a half-awake state. Jake's parents took him to the doctor, where the physicians diagnosed him as entering a strong puberty phase with hormonal changes affecting his mental state. They prescribed him sedatives, hormone regulators, and some hair growth medication. While medication helped him sleep, it also led to a second set of symptoms. Jake began to experience sleep paralysis and frequent nightmares. In his dreams, he often found himself in familiar places, but there were no people around. If there were, he couldn't see their faces, and he mainly dreamed of children. Some dreams repeated themselves, and Jake didn't share the details because he always ended up being pushed over and waking up and startled. He felt as if he had fallen, his body jolting as if he had truly fallen out of bed. Sleep paralysis typically occurred near dawn, when Jake thought he was asleep, but suddenly felt a heavy weight on him, his limbs stiff or numb. His eyelids couldn't open, but his eyeballs would dart around. It felt as if a wardrobe had fallen on him, making it hard to breathe and causing pain throughout his chest. The scariest part during sleep paralysis was hearing the drum beats tapping right next to his ear, steady and rhythmic. He could only wake up if someone touched him. It was very difficult to escape sleep paralysis on his own, even if all he needed was to move a finger. Most of the time, Jake just endured. Each time it happened, his entire body felt exhausted, from his chest to his stomach, as if someone had punched him. His eyes were red, resembling someone who had been awake all night. This was the most difficult time for him, to the point where he was falling behind in growth due to lack of sleep, neglecting his meals, and looking frail. Seeing that Jake had lost 7 kilograms in 3 months while he was at an age where he should be growing, his parents worried that it wasn't just a physical illness, but a mental one. They consulted every doctor and shaman they could find, but Jake continued to suffer from insomnia and a loss of appetite. His grandmother, who was visiting a temple, heard about her grandson's mental struggles and asked for a handful of incense, ash from the temple, to bring home. When she saw how much he was suffering, she tied the bag of ash to the headboard of his bed and placed a large knife under his pillow, sleeping beside him for several nights to keep watch. About a week later, Jake was able to sleep soundly, no longer startled awake or experiencing sleep paralysis. This second phase didn't last long, peaking at just over 6 months. Although he experienced a few episodes afterward, they were not as concerning as before. Jake's grandmother even had a small shrine built in the yard to honor the earth god, fearing that a spirit from the road had followed him home. She believed that honoring the earth god would help ward off spirits from all directions. With this dedication, Jake's family prayed fervently, and for the next few years, no one in the household experienced any hauntings. That was until Jake entered phase 3, where the connection with spirits could follow him for life. Because the issue was never fully resolved, when he went to university in the city, the spiritual affinity flared up again. He noticed strange behavior starting 2 months prior, primarily excessive sleeping and mood swings. Sometimes, while chatting happily with friends, he would suddenly snap and then not understand why he was angry. He always felt restless, unable to focus on completing any task, and he began to see and hear spirits. As for his mood swings, I witnessed them firsthand. One time, the whole group was playing cards just for fun, but with a bit of money involved to make it interesting. While playing the 5th round, Jake suddenly lost control. Just seconds before, he had been shouting out for a win, but then he abruptly discarded his cards and threw away someone else's cards, his face contorting in anger as he mumbled something under his breath. We all shouted at him, asking why he was acting that way, but Jake said nothing. He climbed onto the bed, turned his back to us, and fell asleep. The next day, he acted as if nothing had happened. At that moment, Jake's brain waves were interrupted by another frequency, causing him to act involuntarily. This temporary loss of control was due to being near a compatible source of energy. In simpler terms, the spirit had begun to influence Jake. Such things can happen between living people as well, but it usually only affects emotions, known as emotional resonance, where people can laugh and cry together. However, an influence that directly impacts reasoning is rare. Only mediums can achieve that. Initially, Jake's episodes were infrequent, but soon they became more frequent, making it feel as if he had multiple personalities. One moment he would be smiling, and the next, his expression would darken, only to return to normal conversation right after. When we learned the root of the situation, we were all scared by it. At that time, Jake had begun to clearly see and hear the voices of spirits. He mentioned that the voice sounded like that of a child, which explained why he often heard the sound of drums. Since the dormitory was a public building, there was no guardian spirit, allowing spirits to come and go freely. Jake concluded with a chilling statement. The child spirit was in this room with us. He could only see a grayish-white outline, occasionally moving around. When the rest of us heard him say that, we felt a chill run down our spines, but none of us dared to distance ourselves from him. Jake had already endured so much in silence, and we felt more sympathy for him. I asked if leaving things as they were was dangerous, as it could seriously harm his nervous system in the long run. Had he thought of a solution? Jake replied that he had a plan. There is a temple in North Carolina called the Ham Long Temple, known for its powerful ability to pacify spirits, and he intended to visit it to resolve his spiritual affinity. Ham Long Temple was famous in spiritual circles. People whispered that its location was sacred, and the abbot had profound spiritual powers capable of subduing even the most malevolent spirits. Jake's situation, being followed by a spirit, was not the most dangerous case. There were worse cases, such as Trung Tang, where the dead are controlled by malevolent spirits and return to take their living relatives. Ham Long Temple was known for containing the most Trung spirits in the country, and many types of spirits were brought there, making the temple feel perpetually cold, even in the middle of summer. If anyone intended to resolve their spiritual issues, I would recommend going to a temple and, if possible, making a thorough trip to Ham Long. Just standing in the temple courtyard, one could feel the abundant spiritual energy flowing through, chilling to the bone, making one's knees buckle. Seeking help from shamans usually didn't work. It often resulted in wasted money and increased anxiety. However, for Jake to bring the spirit to the temple, he needed to interact with it, meaning they had to see and communicate with each other. Only then could he accurately identify the spirit following him. If he remained vague, the spirit could easily evade him. For this reason, Jake willingly lived in fear. If we hadn't discovered his situation, he would have continued to keep quiet. Ignorance can be bliss, but once you know, you can't help but worry, especially when trying to sleep at night. After confiding in us, Jake seemed more stable. Essentially, he feared that before he could take the spirit to the temple, he might lose his sanity. He began to dread sleeping. Staying alert during the day was easy, but at night, he couldn't handle it. Finally, Jake told his roommates that he wanted to sleep in each of their beds one night at a time. Lying alone made him feel vulnerable, as if he could be taken away at any moment. To be honest, everyone in our room was scared, but seeing Jake struggle like that, we told ourselves we had to be strong. He had said that if there was no connection, there was no need to worry about being harmed. We agreed to help him, and for the first few days, everything seemed normal. But when it was Jake's turn to sleep in my bed, something happened that night. I was lying outside while Jake was inside, and as I was dozing off, I heard murmuring coming from the wall. I opened my eyes and noticed that Jake had turned to face the wall at some point, and it seemed like he wasn't asleep. He kept mumbling to himself, saying, "What is it?" and then answering himself, "A rice bowl and a pair of chopsticks," followed by, "How long?" and responding, "49 days. I was startled and tapped him on the shoulder, shaking him a bit, asking if he was asleep and what he was talking about. Suddenly, Jake shoved my hand away. He didn't turn to look at me or move, but he continued to speak. "Get out now." The voice sounded like a child, sharp and clear, making it hard to tell if it was male or female. I was terrified and quickly pulled my hand back, lying still with my heart racing. I had intended to leave the bed, but I worried that moving might make him angry. So, I spent the whole night awake, and Jake didn't say anything else. In the morning, I asked him who he had been talking to last night and why I heard a child's voice. At that moment, Jake's face turned pale, and he said he didn't know. He had just been sleeping. After that night, Jake began talking to himself more frequently. Sometimes he would turn to face the corner of the room for an entire hour, not responding to anyone who spoke to him, just mumbling under his breath day or night. This phase of awakening to his spiritual affinity mainly occurred in Jake's mind. He didn't show many external signs, but it fundamentally changed him. There were times when Jake didn't even recognize his roommates. He would glare at everyone with pursed lips and a furrowed brow, becoming increasingly irritable. Suddenly one day, Jake's family showed up at the dormitory, including his grandmother. Everyone talked normally, and no one mentioned the trip to the temple. Afterward, Jake's family left together. The school had granted permission for Jake to take a week off to recover. We thought the situation would be more chaotic, but in reality, it was resolved quite smoothly. When Jake returned, our room erupted with questions. The boy looked much better. The dark spot on his forehead was gone, and his mood was brighter. He explained that when he had asked to sleep in our beds, he had already begun communicating with the spirit, but it seemed he could only speak unconsciously. Therefore, he needed someone nearby to listen and report back to him. Once he could hear and speak, it wasn't long before he could see the spirit. Sure enough, just over a week later, Jake was able to clearly see the form of the spirit. It was still a grayish-white shadow, but he could distinguish its limbs and face. The spirit rarely moved, mostly sitting or huddling in a corner with its back turned. The child's temperament wasn't very harmonious. It often demanded things, like to sleep, and was irritable. Regarding the trip to the temple, Jake quietly contacted his family, mainly his grandmother, to choose a good day for the visit. Since the spirit was a child, its temperament was unpredictable. If it found out it was being forced to go to the temple, it would never agree to follow, and it could cause Jake a lot of trouble later on. Throughout the journey to the temple, Jake was in a dazed state, not recognizing anyone around him, his mind sluggish. Then suddenly, he woke up, feeling lightheaded, as if his limbs finally had strength again, and his chest felt lighter. Most importantly, the dark shadow that had haunted him had vanished. Jake felt as if he had come back to life. Although he still experienced a dull pain from the spirit's influence, overall, he was more alert. At that moment, he was sitting in the main hall of Ham Long Temple, where the abbot had just performed a ceremony to trap the spirit and was reciting prayers in front of him. After hearing the last few chimes of the bell, Jake felt his spirit return fully. It turned out he had been sitting there for 4 hours, his legs nearly numb and unable to stand. The spirit had been trapped, and the connection had been severed. So his family took Jake home to recuperate. Following the abbot's advice, they were told to avoid killing while out and to do some good deeds to accumulate merit. Since then, Jake has not been disturbed anymore, but he still had to visit the hospital for treatment of the neurological effects, which has now been 3 years. Spiritual affinity is no joke. If you want to know whether a spirit is following you, it's essential to understand the root of the issue. Moreover, many people today make money from the spiritual profession. If you blindly follow your feelings, you may end up wasting money, and you could inadvertently harm your own fate. Remember that the realms of the living and the dead are very close. One step out the door, and you might encounter the dead, and if you're truly caught off guard, you may be dragged along with them without knowing it. It's best to live calmly, and believing in spirits or deities is not as important as believing in yourself. People come in all kinds. Not everyone is haunted by spirits. Strive to live positively, and if you encounter misfortune, don't assume it's due to spiritual influence. Spirits arise from the mind. Overthinking can lead to problems. It's better to pray for a peaceful life, as matters of the spirit world are beyond our control.